Hello, everyone. Welcome to Meadows Workshop Series, designed to help California cannabis dispensaries and delivery operators elevate their operations across the board in this new and challenging retail environment. We know that creating standard investment terms can be a costly legal barrier for many cannabis businesses. Today, we're sharing best practices for new operators when it comes to fundraising. You'll hear today about how to raise money, how to identify good agreements, create fair investment contracts, and avoid costly mistakes when fundraising. For those of you who don't know us, Meadow builds California cannabis-specific point-of-sale and delivery software that's designed for speed, volume, and profitability. Our all-in-one platform has all of the tools you need to run and scale your business while saving time, increasing revenue, and staying compliant with state and local regulations. With Meadows software, you can sell in-store, online, as well as execute pickup and delivery options all inside of Meadow without any third-party integrations. We also integrate with Weedmaps and Leafly, as well as QuickBooks, and you're even able to use Google Tag Manager to track real-time dynamic engagement on your website using our Meadow e-commerce menu. Meadow is the fastest, most complete, and easy-to-use system in California. I'm happy today to introduce Meadow's CEO and co-founder David Hua, who will be sharing his perspective about cannabis fundraising as a startup, and he will also be moderating today's conversation. So Hua, please take it away.
Hey, hi everybody. Thanks for being with us here today. Meadow got to start back in 2014. We were one of the first cannabis startups to be accepted in Y Combinator, a startup accelerator that's launched more than 2,000 companies. Stripe, Airbnb, DoorDash, I believe Airbnb and DoorDash have their IPOs coming. You can check that out. Instacart, Dropbox, Twitch, I mean, all of them are there. And so the fundraising landscape is pretty familiar for us, knowing that we had that knowledge and experience. But the cannabis investment landscape has changed dramatically. Now, in 2013, US startups in the cannabis sector raised $16 million from 11 venture firms. And I think last year we had over $2 billion that was invested over, over 200 different deals. So a lot of money has been raised, but a lot of that money has gone to lawyers and instead of putting it to work. So our goal is to really help, bridge that gap today and help people, learn about fundraising. For us, when we first raised in 2014, we used a version of a YC Safe. It's a simple agreement for equity. We raised $2.5 million, and some of our first checks, one was from one of my co-founders' moms, and she wrote us a nice check, and we used a safe. Another one right after that was a check from Joe Montana with Liquid 2 Ventures. And it was interesting. We got a chance to meet him and their team, and we kept in touch. We were able to build a relationship, even though I was a little bit starstruck. And what was great about the safe was we were able to quickly send it over, negotiate the valuation, sign, and get money in the bank all within a couple days. And to have that confidence to be able to use that agreement with different operators and not have to worry about the terms and all of that, especially something that I wasn't familiar with, was really helpful to me as a founder. And, as we were getting this money, we realized that this money is not actually ours. We had to return this money back to the investor tenfold. And I remember, every dollar I don't spend doing that, I have to spend it to a lawyer or look at this contract or go through it or, different rounds of, spending. We wanted to be a really good caretaker of that capital, and fundraising is this fuel for the tank. It's not something, we try to put too much effort in. We want to get gas in the tank and keep going. And if you're adding someone to your cap table, you also want to make sure you're comfortable with them for life of the company. And plant touching businesses in cannabis have a totally different set of regulations, both on a state and local level. So our goal is to really help not only provide knowledge, but also provide a way to bridge the gap with paperwork. We also see a lot of value of having an open source paperwork that we can all leverage, especially if you're in your early days who may not be aware of different standards. So with approval of YC, Meadow has adapted the YC Safe with nuances of the legal cannabis in collaboration with Mayfield Venture Law, Leland, Parachini, Steinberg, Matzger, and Melnick, who Lara works with, Greenbridge Corporate Counsel with Rashid, and Clark Howell with Nicole and Ariel over there. It's been an awesome group to work with. So a little bit about the introduction to the SAFE that's debuting today here. It's modeled on Y Combinator's Post Money Safe. The Cannabis Safe is new and open source document created to standardize and streamline early stage financing for cannabis businesses. And it's been optimized and customized for California cannabis corporations and investors to address the compliance with commercial cannabis investments, taking into account the regulatory nuances of the highly regulated legal cannabis industry. It's now available. It's free. It's for anyone to use. Now we're here to talk about fundraising. And so with that being said, we'll be talking about the Cannabis Safe, answering questions about how to raise funds and avoid these mistakes that a lot of us have made so you don't have to make them as well. So turn it back over to Aria to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get going.
Great, thanks, Hua. So I just dropped the link into the chat where you can check out the Cannabis Safe. And today we're so pleased to introduce 3 top legal teams who are here to tell you more about this document, which is now available to you, as well as share some best practices for cannabis fundraising. So first we have Jason Kornfeld, who specializes in the representation of startups and emerging growth companies throughout various stages of their life cycle, including corporate formation, structuring and governance matters, commercial transactions, venture capital financing transactions, and mergers and acquisitions. Prior to MVL, Jason worked at Atrium, where he built and led the firm's cannabis practice. Before Atrium, Jason worked in Covington and Burling's corporate group in its San Francisco office. Welcome, Jason. Next, we have Laura DeCaro, who's a business attorney and mediator. She has concentrated her legal career in the areas of intellectual property, corporate governance and compliance, commercial transactions, real property, and mediation. Most of her clients come from highly regulated industries, and she has translated that knowledge into a comprehensive medical cannabis practice for the last 12 years. Lara is a founding board member, former executive officer, and current advisory board member of the International Cannabis Bar Association, and she currently sits on the executive committee of the Bar Association of San Francisco Cannabis Law Section. She's a frequent speaker on matters of cannabis business law, and we're so happy to welcome Lara. Finally, but not least, we have Khurshid Khoja, who's the principal of Greenbridge Corporate Counsel, a business law firm he founded in 2012 to represent legal cannabis businesses on regulatory and transactional matters. Khurshid currently serves as the chair of the board of directors of the National Cannabis Industry Association and the co-chair of the NCIA Policy Council. He has previously served as outside general counsel to the ArcView Investor Network, is on the board of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, the California State Treasurer's Cannabis Banking Working Group, and is a founding board member and general counsel of the California Cannabis Industry Association, and is a co-founder and general counsel to the Emerald Growers Association, later the California Growers Association. So thank you, Lara, Jason, and Khurshid for being here today and helping to create this document, which we know will help simplify cannabis fundraising for both founders and investors. So I will pass it over to Hua, and let's get into it.
All right, let's do it. Thanks for those introductions. Thank you, Jason, Lara, Khurshid, for joining and being part of this, and sharing your knowledge and helping with collaborate on the SAFE. And thank you for YC for approving it. So Jason, let's start with you. Can you explain what a SAFE is? How's it different from a note? We have 3 different versions on the website. Can you explain the differences between the 3 and their use cases?
Yeah, for sure. So as you mentioned before, HUA, SAFE stands for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. That means, I mean, some of our listeners say you might already know what this means, but to start off simple, you're essentially receiving money in exchange for that money converting into equity at a future point in time upon the occurrence of certain events. And generally speaking, that the main event that everybody's assuming is going to happen is an equity financing of the company. So like a Series A, Series C, you might have heard that, but you sell preferred equity in your company. Sometimes though, with the SAFE, it can, it does have these conversion mechanics in it for, like, let's say what happens if you don't ever raise an equity round. So it would convert into stock, like for example, common stock of your company upon, if you were to just like sell your company before you actually have an equity financing. That really doesn't happen very often. So everybody's assuming it will convert into preferred stock. And so the whole intent is that based on whatever the terms are of the SAFE, it will convert it at a discount as to what those new cash investors are paying at your Series A. So in really simple terms, let's say the new investors are paying $1 per share of Series A preferred stock. The SAFE is designed so that whoever holds a SAFE will actually convert into a series of Series A preferred stock at a discount. So for example, if the discount that's negotiated is 20%, let's say they invested $100,000 on a SAFE, that $100,000 would pay 80 cents a share for Series A preferred stock rather than the new price of $1 per share. So you're not selling, when you raise money on a SAFE, you're not selling equity today. It's more of a future right to equity. So that's the general mechanics. Now, as many of you may have heard, YC has multiple flavors of the SAFE. There was the old pre-money SAFE, and that was basically what Y Combinator was using up until middle of 2019, when they came out with a new version of the SAFE called the post-money SAFE. The main differences that you want to be aware of are with the pre-money SAFE, the conversion mechanics are a little bit different in that the calculation of what that conversion price is. So as I was saying before, like how you get to what the discount is on the new preferred price. So as I was saying before, like how do you get to that? It's a 20% discount. Those change slightly between the forms of SAFEs, and each have their own benefits and downsides. So you want to, definitely inform yourself as to which probably makes the most sense for your fundraise. But the main thing that the main difference at a high level to be aware of is that with the post-money SAFE, its intent is that you can more accurately forecast how much of your company you're going to be selling when that SAFE does convert into equity. So it's a really great tool right now that a lot of people are using more often than the pre-money SAFE, because it can provide a lot more security in terms of investors being like, okay, we're definitely going to be getting this percentage of your company when it does convert. Whereas the pre-money SAFE has certain components to it that make it a little wishy-washy. I wouldn't say wishy-washy, but not as obvious right out the gate. So if, an example of the way how you want to think though of pre versus post money as well, like that's a separate term of art that we use when we're raising money. And that's what these SAFEs are kind of intended to pick up on, is a pre-money SAFE. When let's just say you have a SAFE with a valuation cap. So you're assuming that the SAFE's going to, it'll say like something like, let's say it's $10 million, right? So we're assuming that the SAFE's going to convert based on a future valuation of the company being greater than, so let me back up. The $10 million that we're saying, that's what the SAFE will convert at. So you're hoping that when you raise money at your Series A, the valuation will be greater than that. But when you're raising on a SAFE that's a pre-money SAFE, your post-money valuation in theory for that pre-money SAFE is how much you raise in your entire SAFE round. So let's say you're using a $10 million valuation cap and you raise $1 million on your SAFEs. That means you've essentially sold 1 million divided by $11 million, because to determine the post-money for purposes of, like, this is back of the napkin math, of course. So there's some other factors that you need to put into this. You would be looking at a post-money valuation of 11 million. So it's the pre-money of 10 that you're setting with the valuation cap plus the $1 million. The post-money SAFE is slightly different because it sets that post-money valuation ahead of time. So you would say the post-money valuation cap on this SAFE, let's say it's $10 million, and you sell $1 million in your round. That means now you had a pre-money valuation of $9 million. The upside to using for founders who don't know how much they're going to raise in their round, and they just want to do a ton of SAFEs without having to worry about, did I sell more in my company than I'm worried of? The pre-money SAFE can be a little bit better for that, because to a certain extent, you just need to be careful that you don't just do way too many SAFEs, because all of a sudden you've set what the pre-money is and you're just selling a ton of safes. And so if you're not really forecasting it, you can end up selling like 2 million. So now you're increasing the post money, but that potentially will dilute all the other safe holders. This all goes into the conversion mechanics. With the post money safe, you do set a ceiling on how much you're going to raise, but this can also become problematic because this can over dilute you as founders if you raise too much on that post money safe. So like if you say, we're going to do a $10 million post money safe, but raise more than $1 million, now the founders are the only ones taking that dilution when that safe converts rather than spreading it across all of your safe holders. So there's some things that you will need to be aware of in those conversion mechanics. And like, we could talk about this forever. I believe Ari is going to post a link to a YouTube video that my partner recently did this last year that kind of goes through all the mental math that you need to be aware of and how to set your valuation cap and how much you want to raise. But long story short is the math is different for both. And there are different considerations you should be aware of as to how, what kind of dilution you're looking at, whether you're talking about it as a pre-money safe or a post-money safe. And so I would implore you to go through that and just like do some of the mental maths or some of the math scenarios so you can become more familiar with the differences. And then one quick thing I did want to touch on, the big difference between a safe and a convertible note. You sometimes might hear people use the term safe note or note when they mean a safe, but really a safe is a safe. And a convertible note is usually what we refer to as a note. The big difference being that a convertible note carries interest and it has a maturity date. And so there's other, terms in there that become a little bit more nuanced to negotiate. So as a result of just the general concept of it being debt, it's a lot less company favorable, because I think what you might see, especially with cannabis companies, is you don't raise that Series A, in a 12-month timeline or 18-month timeline. So you start having to deal with the issue of, I have these convertible notes that are getting really close to their maturity dates. How do we deal with that? And is that, it just creates a lot more complexity as to, are they going to force a maturity conversion, or are they going to end up just remaining out there and accruing more interest? And as a result, it just kind of makes it much more complex. And so that's why who was saying just using a safe is super simple, because there is no maturity date. You don't have to worry about them just converting it, in 1 year or 2 years. It's just whenever you raise your next round or sell your company. So it just allows you to really focus on your business, stay heads down, and, work toward that Series A that everybody wants.
Nice. Solid. And happy 420, everybody. If you got it, light it up. We're going to move on to the Khursheed and Lara. What have you seen are key issues with raising funds in the cannabis space? What works, what doesn't? Khursheed, we'll start with you, and then we'll go on to Lara.
Sure. So I guess we can start with valuations. In terms of valuations, when you're dealing with a pre-revenue company, right, it's very difficult to set a valuation. You don't know how much your company is going to be worth. The best you can do is, provide pro forma financial projections of what you think you're going to do over the coming years, and base a valuation on that. But again, it's very difficult to do that when you are pre-revenue. And it's really an art. And if you're in, there are some kind of customs in terms of valuation. Like if you're in the retail space, generally you're looking at a multiplier of 1x times your revenue, or a little bit more than that, depending on the market. But the safe allows you to basically kind of punt on that, right? So you don't have to. A valuation cap is not the same thing as setting a valuation, right? When you're selling equity, you have to say, this is what the company is worth, and so each share of stock is worth this, right? And that's the basis upon which you're selling you the stock. But again, if you don't know what you're going to be making in the coming years, you don't know your chances of success. Again, that valuation number, what your company is worth, is really kind of based on art more than anything else. And so I think that is one of the big benefits of the safe, is that you can punt on that. You don't have to have that. You don't have to haggle over the valuation at the outset. That's something that you set the valuation cap at, and then hopefully you get there, and the investor sees some upside from setting the valuation cap at a lower level than what it's actually worth when there's a raise down the line to trigger the conversion. In terms of investor expectations, we often see that even sophisticated accredited investors are not always well informed on the cannabis industry and the regulatory challenges that face cannabis businesses. So oftentimes it's a surprise to investors that, what do you mean I can't deposit my distributions from my stock in a bank account, right? Well, that would technically violate money laundering laws, right? And so, and oh, by the way, the company also doesn't have a bank account, and can't get one, right? And so those types of things are often news, even to accredited investors who are diving into the cannabis industry. They often don't know about Internal Revenue Code Section 280E, a lot of big things that they don't necessarily understand. Some folks even may not understand that cannabis is still federally illegal because they see it legal in all these states, in the majority of states. And so, that is that is something that we generally address with robust disclosures, even when we're dealing with accredited investors, because we don't know what they don't know. And we don't want to be guilty, or don't want to be accused of omitting any material facts as an issuer of securities to an investor, right? And so better safe than sorry. And so we oftentimes will put forward more disclosures than you might otherwise see in a seed round or other rounds where you're dealing with accredited investors that normally wouldn't need that level of disclosure. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything Christine has to say. I think, one of the longstanding practices of the industry has been to create these additional disclosures, right? So even before we had a state legalization program in California, a lot of us had those disclosures set up. It's been difficult for our clients to digest those and to attach those to their offerings because they can have a tendency to scare investors when they look at them, but they're really necessary. And so I think investor expectations has primarily been the impediment to most capital injections that I have experienced. And it can even translate into, their attorney's experience in the cannabis industry. So it's not just the investor, but it's also their attorney's experience level, and really connecting them with someone who can impartially explain to them what the rules are of investment in your particular community, but also with regard to federal illegalization and the other impediments to investing. I think, that's been a really value-added practice that we've been able to bring to a lot of clients. It's just connecting them with other independent counselors. The other thing that I see is, and I don't have a better term for this really than regulatory paternalism. Investors just don't get it. Like they're like, well, why would regulators tell you can't do this or you can't do that? And what do you mean we can't sell the company for 10 years? Or what do you mean I can't, have this percentage? Or what do you mean I can't have preferred shares? And they just don't believe it. And no matter how many times you tell them that this is really how it is, like they really have a hard time believing it because it is fundamentally unfair, right? And you think about people who are used to operating in a traditional capitalistic society, and to be told that, the game as they're used to playing it, and maybe calling for a contract under a state's law that does not recognize cannabis, is not a best practice. It becomes a little bit of an educational experience for everybody. And so, being patient with investors and really trying to dig down into those issues early on, I think is very important.
Awesome. Any of you guys can jump in here. New businesses are starting up. Many of them are equity businesses. With such restrictions in place by local ordinances, how do you think about scaling an equity license or business?
I think, probably the thing that's top of everybody's mind is how, I guess, high level, right? Like if you're a typical venture-backed company, you don't have these limits on how much equity you can sell in your company. So let's say on average, just a typical venture model, is, your friends and family seed round, let's say it's on safes, you're going to sell anywhere from 15 to maybe, even 30% of your company. And your Series A will be, you're going to sell, another, 15 to 30% of your company, but usually probably around 20. So by the time you get to your Series A, you could have sold anywhere from like 30 to, almost half of your percent of your company, assuming there's a typical venture-backed model. Plus, you have to keep in mind how much of the company you've reserved for employee equity. So that, automatically makes it really difficult to raise money in the venture model if you're an equity applicant. So it means, you're going to have to work with investors in a way where they're cognizant of that if you're going to kind of go the equity route. Otherwise, you're pretty much looking at debt funding, which is the only thing that, is not selling equity. I know, Krishi, did you want to touch on that at all?
No, I would endorse that. I think that essentially you have to be really mindful up front about dilution going in, right? When you're from the get-go, you have to know how much you're going to reserve and sell through the safe, and what's going to come later on, and anticipating that you are going to need additional equity for employees. You are going to need additional equity for follow-on rounds, right? Yeah, I mean, debt is attractive from the sense that you don't have to give away more of your company, but it's still debt, right? And it's still something that's on the books, and that can be difficult, and can also dissuade investors from coming in later on if you do have equity free up for some reason, if there's a lot of debt on the books. And so, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, one of the things that we've seen people do, which some of the regulators are smarter about than others, right, are entering into management services agreements or long-term lease agreements, right, with business partners as a way to help them participate, right, in a business without actually distributing capital equity to these people. I'm sorry. So those are a couple of tools that we've seen. It really depends on how sophisticated the documentation is, but there are other ways aside from just pure debt, but most of it's debt.
Yeah, and so like just talking, full circle, just to bring it back to the safe is potentially great, right? Because it can hang out there for, years without converting. And so in theory, you haven't sold equity in your company just yet. But if you're not careful as to sort of how you structure the terms of that safe, it could end up converting into a large chunk of equity that you weren't expecting. So I think, it's really important to understand the mechanics of, the terms of your safe and what it potentially could convert into. I know we'll touch on this sort of, later in terms of how we structure the safe to sort of tackle some of these issues should they arise, but it's not, a perfect fix, and it ends up being, an investor relations issue so it's, as Krishid's already said, and Laura, it's really important to really educate your investors or lenders on all, and make sure everybody's on the same page about these things, and the documentation reflects that, because you don't want to have to unwind money. That's really not a fun place to be.
Yeah, I mean,
one other note, with some of these other arrangements, like profits interest or other things, there can still be disclosure requirements related to that too, right? And so I think that's something that a lot of investors don't necessarily understand up front, and can also kind of shape the options that you have, right? If someone doesn't want to be disclosed as an owner, then maybe they don't want equity, right? But even so, certain profits interest, at least in California, are under the BCC regs, for example. If you have a 20% profits ownership, you are technically an owner, so you still have to go through that ownership disclosure process, and I call it the proctology exam. Still have to go through that. And a lot of investors just don't want anything to do with that at all, right? And so that could shape your options as well, but it's something to prepare your investors for, regardless of whether you're exploring equity, debt, profits, interest, other mechanisms.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you're getting married with these people on your cap table, and you're going to go through a lot with them, and they're believers. They'll have to do these disclosures. But hopefully, with the safe and what you're doing now, you get a little bit of time. Krishid, you did mention dilution earlier. Can you just dive in there a little bit more? how operators need to be thinking about that. There are local ownership requirements and percentages you must hold. So, what are your thoughts about dilution and ownership percentages and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to assume that most folks understand dilution. I will, I would say that they have to know the issuers and the investors should have a really good grasp of what their local rules are, especially if they are a social equity qualified business, right? Because that's all going to be predetermined at the local level, how much equity a social equity licensee needs to hold and needs to maintain in order to maintain that status, right? And to maintain that license. And so I think that's a kind of an upfront consideration. Depending on your jurisdiction, you're going to have to be prepared to have that discussion with your investors up front and say, oh, hey, by the way, you're never going to own a majority interest of this company. It's just not possible, right? And that may be news to the investor. And so having that discussion up front it makes good sense. In terms of kind of, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
No, I was just nodding in total agreement, like early and often disclosure.
Yeah, and we tried to build that into the SAFE as well to say, hey, look, at a certain point, you may not be able to hold, the investor may not be able to hold all of this investment, and you may need to sell some of it back potentially, right, in order to maintain the licensing status of the entity in which you invested. So I think those are kind of initial things that all operators and folks who are pre-revenue need to be thinking about. I had this great analogy to a Thanksgiving dinner party with, somebody's got enough to make 5 pumpkin pies. They only bake 1 pumpkin pie, and so whoever gets that pie gets 100% of the pie. If they invite other people to their dinner party, then they're going to make 2 pies, and suddenly, the person who got the whole pie only has 50% of all pies. But that kind of, the more I get into that, the hungrier I get. So I'm going to not talk about that analogy. But essentially, like, that's what we're talking about for folks who aren't necessarily familiar with dilution. Get familiar with dilution as soon as possible before you start raising money, because you need to understand, math is math, right? There's only 100% in a pie, period, end of story. There's not 120%. There's not 90%, there's 100%, and that's always going to be true.
Math is math. Yeah, that's true. The other thing that I think that operators need to think about too, that's just kind of a little bit beyond dilution, is the investor qualifications, right? So, one of the things that we run up against is that investors somehow would not qualify as an owner. And, being able to, undo your transaction with someone who may, between the time of execution of the SAFE and conversion, somehow become disqualified, being able to do that, being adequately capitalized to do that, having those considerations in the back of your mind and in your game plan, I think are of additional importance to consider.
Yeah. And just speaking of math, right? Like and I forgot to touch on this in the beginning of sort of the different forms of safes. We posted 3 of the 4. Y Combinator's technically created 4. The one that I left out is just called the MFN safe. No one really ever uses that very often. So we're happy to post one if by popular demand, everybody wants that. But generally speaking, the main forms of safes that we see out there are a valuation cap only, a valuation or a discount only, and a combination of valuation cap and a discount. And essentially how those 3 differ is that it's a valuation cap only, like that's the main one that we see the most, right? Where we're saying, hey, we're all expecting that the company will be at least this much valued at this much in the future, probably way more when, the Series A happens. So we'll convert at the more discounted valuation, which is the valuation cap. The second one is the discount only. So we're just saying whatever the new preferred price is. So for the Series A, let's say it's $1, we get a 20% discount on that. So we only pay 80 cents a share when we convert. And then the third one is it gives investors downside protection by saying we convert at whatever gives us the lowest price, either the valuation cap or the discount. So when we're talking about dilution, and it's really important to sort of take your current cap table, whatever it might be, and it might just be you, right? Maybe one other founder, but to still really model out sort of, okay, are we going to raise how much money? What are going to be the terms of that safe? And assuming we raise a Series A at, you can play around with these numbers, but at a $20 million valuation, 30, whatever it might be, what's a dilution going to look like hypothetically for us? And if you're an equity applicant, does this keep us within the realm of possibility of being able to execute this fundraise process? So those are all questions I'd really recommend asking. And so when we're talking about, like, it's a lot easier to kind of just figure the math out with the discount on the Series A, but generally most people, like I was saying, use the valuation cap safe. And so the back of the napkin math there is, depending on whether it's a post money or pre-money safe, let's say it's pre-money, like I was saying before, if you're going to give it a pre-money valuation of $9 million and raise $1 million, that means your post-money valuation is 10 million. So you sold 10% of your company. Just do 1 divided by 10. It's the same math with the post-money safe, but you don't add it on like I kind of just did with the pre-money safe. And so that's generally, like, if you're in a meeting talking really quickly and you're just trying to understand, like, roughly how much am I selling, that's kind of with a valuation cap, how you can think about it. With a discount, a little bit trickier because you got to actually model that out and understand what the preferred price is going to be to understand how much of a discount you get. But that's kind of when we're talking about dilution for the safe, how you need to be thinking about it before you say, yes, I can accept these terms. And even at like an even higher level, right? If you're like, I want to raise $1 million, then you got to think, okay, what's my valuation need to be for that valuation cap so that I don't sell more of the company that I'm willing to do. So let's say you want to raise $1 million. You can't just go out and necessarily say it'll be a $2 million valuation cap, because now you've sold like a huge chunk of your company. So these are the kind of math scenarios that we run with all of our clients to make sure that, the dilution's acceptable and they really are able to forecast, like, these are the terms that we can accept. But yeah, so that's sort of high level dilution talk on the math side as well.
Cool. Do you guys want to touch upon how this safe, this Cannabis Safe, will be useful for new operators? And then from there, we'll go in some terms. And we got a bunch of questions from registrants that I'd love to field to you guys in an open Q&A after that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think we kind of started touching on this already. The majority of the edits we made, pretty much all the edits we made to the safe really are regulatory focused. So for example, if for those who may have already gone to the link, you can see that, we've made edits that are specific to, if you're an equity applicant, to add this in, because it's the disclosure around, that different regulations apply to you and ownership thresholds exist. And we've just generally kind of weaved into the safe the concept that regulatory approvals and notice requirements are out there, and that we need to, and companies need to comply with that. And investors, will make sure to cooperate with the companies in order to make sure companies are compliant. And, like we said before, if anything needs to be unwound, that we can do that. But that's kind of generally the spirit of the edits. One thing I do want to say is we inserted a footnote on the first page. We are, Kershid, Laura, and I, we are, focused on the California market primarily. So that's really what these edits were intended to address. I think with certain tweaks, you could probably make this, there's similar jurisdictions out there, so things would work. But I wouldn't just take this, copy and paste, and use this in Massachusetts or wherever without consulting local counsel there to make sure you're not triggering things that you definitely need to make sure are inserted into the safe. And secondly, this safe is intended for use with a corporate, like a C Corp, right? When you are taking investment in LLC, there are other tax implications and just the mechanics there, where, like, for example, the safe refers to stock. There's no stock in an LLC. So please, we recommend not copying this and just taking it and having people sign it, and now it's in your LLC. So yeah, those are my high level comments. Laura or Kershid, anything else to add?
No, I think those are right on target. I was going to bring those up as well. I think, hopefully this will provide a more cost-effective vehicle for investment, right? What Hua brought up at the beginning, really, which was, how to get cash quick without spending a ton on your lawyers. Not that we don't appreciate the work, but we all need to participate, right, in that. And so I think that hopefully this can provide some mechanism for people to kind of circumvent all of the pomp and circumstance of a larger group of definitive agreements.
And this is kind of to add to that, this is kind of a neutral starting point for parties, right? They can take this, it's an open source document, they know where it comes from, they know, the origins of it, and they can run a red line afterwards. They can run a comparison afterwards to see what's been changed, right? So it's a common starting space, and that in and of itself is going to save you a ton of money when you don't have to pay someone to generate an initial draft of your investment agreement. So that's a big time saver. You cut back on negotiations, you cut back on legal fees. There's definitely a time and a place to spend money on your lawyers. This isn't necessarily it, right? So this is a great tool if you don't have to generate a brand new note agreement or brand new equity agreement, and you can get agreement on the fact that, hey, we don't have equity now, we're going to have it in the future, and we're going to set the valuation cap. It's a much more streamlined negotiation, much cheaper.
Nice. Well, in case you missed the link we shared at the beginning, there's a glossary of fundraising terms. Ari's going to drop that into the chat again. And we'll also add that YouTube link too. Then you get a more in-depth view of safes and have fun instead of watching Netflix. Okay, cool. So we're going to move on to questions. We also have a link in the chat where you can find the safe as well. getmeadow.com/cannabis-safe. So other questions that have come, I'm just gonna, whoever wants to answer, we'll kind of go rapid fire and see how you guys feel. As a social equity applicant who has to maintain a 51% equity and I've already given away 49%, how do I raise additional capital?
Yeah, I think we kind of have already touched on this one just naturally in our conversation, but it's outside of doing sort of what's called a recapitalization of your company, which investors are going to hate, and you're only going to get them to do that if they think it's the only possible way that you're going to survive, which basically means diluting everybody down, is, you're probably going to be going the debt route or have, some very creative version of like a convertible security that only converts on very specific terms and making sure that you have full control over that. Or, as Laura was saying, some kind of, commercial partnership type agreements that have financial incentives in a different way in terms of getting money in and out of your business.
Yeah. And be careful too, when you go for a recap, if you're doing something along those lines, oftentimes it'll involve some kind of convoluted structure with new share classes and the like. And those are scrutinized heavily by the regulators, particularly in the equity field. And definitely frowned upon, at least squinted at. So be careful when you go down that road and talk to, even feel free to reach out to the regulators in your jurisdiction. I don't know where most of our attendees are located, but here in San Francisco, our regulators are actually quite approachable. And if you need a straw person to go in for you, I'm sure you can, hire a lawyer to go and have the conversation, but it really can prevent a lot of heartaches if you go in and you talk to the regulators about what you want to do, and they can help guide you because they understand. They want to create a legacy business for you. They don't want this to become something that is an unsellable asset, or is unable to open its doors because you can't get adequate funding. So to the extent that you can, I highly recommend you create those relationships, reach out, talk to them. They may have some really good ideas.
Yeah. One thing to note as a kind of contrapoint is that, while, all the regulators want their licensees to succeed, they are also keenly aware of their, their function as trying to keep bad actors out of the industry, right? And they take that function, they take that mission very seriously, as they should. But oftentimes that zeal can emerge at the most inopportune times and most inopportune circumstances, where you are just trying to do something that's fairly routine, right? And because our regulators are not securities lawyers, they don't always understand exactly what's happening, right? Which is not that, that they're not, they can certainly grasp these concepts if they had some experience with them, but oftentimes they don't necessarily have that experience with them, and some of them are learning as they go. And they are mastering these concepts, but again, there's a lot of risk for folks, conflating sort of things that you kind of do as a matter of course in a business, such as a recap and these bad actor provisions that they are mandated to enforce.
Got it. So what if we go all the way to the beginning, instead of saying, all right, you've already sold your company, like how do you look at structuring equitable and fair contracts, right? You've kind of been at the negotiation table, you've done mediation when things have gone bad. So if you kind of wind the crystal ball back and like say, all right, this is how you should structure and this is what to look out for, what advice would you have there? Or what, thoughts do you have there? Not advice.
I think, there are fairly standard provisions and investment documents that have to do with, for example, governance, right? Investors generally of any size beyond like 10% or more, really any point though, they want the ability to kind of guide the company and to safeguard their investment, right? And so oftentimes they will negotiate a board seat, they will negotiate other ways to participate in the governance of the company, and that may or may not always comply with local social equity ordinances or other ordinances that are in place, such as the bad actor provisions that we were talking about before. If they've got a history, we'll put it charitably. So those types of provisions, those are things that are going to have an impact down the line as you grow your board, as as the company matures. So those types of provisions, oftentimes investors will, negotiate preemptive rights, right? The right to kind of, if you're bringing in additional investors, the initial investor wants to maintain their right to own the same amount of the company as they did prior to that next round, right? And so that can complicate your cap table in terms of dilution and kind of trigger these issues that Jason and Laura talked about before under the social equity ordinances. So there are provisions like that you have to be mindful of, at the outset again, so that you're not tripping on them later on.
Yeah, and going to those points, I mean, a lot of the sort of standard investment paper that's out there doesn't really comport with cannabis as a culture, let alone equity as a requirement or social equity as a requirement. So I think if we're going to talk about what's fair to an investor, it may be totally different than what is fair to a founder. And recognizing, right, who is your client when we talk about what is a fair contract. I don't know. I mean, it really depends on your point of view. I think, though, that even-handed agreements, agreements that recognize what both sides are bringing and that the venture would not be possible without both, particularly in the case of an equity applicant where you're not getting a license unless you have this person, this human with you in your application. And therefore, they bring a significant amount of value, even though it may not be money that you can, feel. And so I do think that, really just, focusing on the reality of what everybody brings can help you to formulate, or your attorneys to formulate the most even-handed agreements, and then trying to make sure that those terms are offered as much as possible, right, on similar terms to similarly situated investors. Obviously, you're going to have investors that come along and may be entitled to, or may require better terms than prior investors. That's just the way it goes. But I think we can all agree that there's a fundamental sense of fairness in the cannabis community that a lot of us kind of grew up with in the community, and we could tap into that in creating the documents. But it is a perspective question.
Yeah. And I think one thing I will also say, and this is obviously, I'm definitely a lot more company side than investor side in a lot of the deals I do now, but especially in the early stage space, to all of you earlier stage companies, be very cautious about when an investor tells you what's in their side letter or whatever, telling you that it's market, because, I think it's pretty, I've done, the amount of deals that we see all the time, we know it's market. So that's where attorneys can honestly add a lot of value sometimes, is being able to sanity check, like, is this a fair ask based on how much money they're putting in, what they're bringing to the table and that sort of thing? Or are they just really overreaching? And is this actually a little bit concerning that they're, being this aggressive at this stage? And what are they kind of signaling as to how this relationship is going to be for the next year, especially when it comes time to really material transactions in the company or something like that? So, one thing I will say is, like, very rarely should you give up a board seat in connection with a safe round. That's probably my best advice to you for early stage companies, because it, for the most part, does not work out well. You can give up what's called a board observer seat, but do not get that confused with an actual board seat. And, I think rights that come in like a side letter in connection with the safe financing are pretty standardized now. So if you reach out, to a lawyer that's pretty well versed in venture deals, anybody can answer those questions pretty quickly for you.
Solid. What is the best way for, I guess there's a bunch of questions around management companies and licensees and how they're working together and structuring those types of deals. I think we could spend a whole webinar on that alone, but curious to hear your thoughts. It's been asked about a lot, and what you're seeing.
Who wants to touch that first?
You are more interested in taking something along these lines, Laura.
I am. Okay. Thanks for telling me what I'm interested in. Okay, that's one of those things, right? I mean, it was a common corporate structure for cannabis businesses in California, particularly because of our pre-legalization structure. And in consideration of certain tax limitations at the federal level. And then those federal decision makers started conflating the organizations and bringing them all together anyway and treating them as one. And so it became less of a useful tool, and people decided to streamline more. But those are traditional, I would say, traditional corporate structures. They're not necessarily the social equity corporate structure. So I've seen a lot of streamlining and less of like kind of the hub and spoke corporate model in my own personal practice. Now, as people try to just kind of, I think, bring it all together outside of like holding licenses. So people will still hold multiple licenses, but in multiple LLCs to diversify risk, or multiple corporations or whatever, to diversify their risk. But we're not seeing as much on like the pulling money out through the management services agreement in the ordinary corporate field. I don't know, Jason, Khurshid, what you're seeing, if you've seen that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Really not too much gamesmanship on the 280E side, as much as it's more about, structuring all your permits into separate entities and treating them like separate business units. But
solid.
Yeah. What about you, Khurshid?
I generally agree. We tend to dissuade folks who are thinking that they will have a huge tax advantage somehow by having the management company set up. It's just not the case anymore. And so there's got to be a good reason for having that management company in place, and you're going to have to disclose them. It's very rare that you wouldn't. Depends on how they're being compensated, but ultimately they're going to be deemed an owner as well.
Solid. So we have time for one more question, or maybe two, depending on how long this one takes. This one's the money question. I've been waiting to say this all webinar. So how do you go get the money? Where do you go get the money? What are the best ways to get the money? You know, how do you envision people going to find the money? You know, you've seen a lot of different ways of people getting the capital, and sharing some of that would be great.
I'll put in a plug for ArcView. I've been involved with the ArcView Investor Network since 2011. I hosted their very first meeting. It got me fired at my law firm. So I wouldn't be where I am today without ArcView. And,
No. So he hosted the second meeting in my office.
right, and luckily Laura survived, but in any case, it is still a great venue, I think, for startup companies to find angels. And you know, in addition to angels, now the makeup of ArcView over the past several years, you see a lot. You know, you see a lot more diversity in terms of the investor class that's there, right? So you see funds, you see you know, family funds, you see hedge funds, you see all sorts of other actors in the game now who are at ArcView, and before the pandemic were at all the meetings. And so I definitely would endorse ArcView and other groups, angel groups like that in the cannabis industry. I think they're a good place to start, or at least to consider.
Yeah, there's some pitch events, I guess, at Weed Club, right, which Evan runs. So you know, that's like a little bit more of like a speed dating round type of approach. But getting involved with that type of fundraiser event is a good way to meet people, even if you don't win the pitch event. And it's a great way to practice your pitch. So when you're talking to investors next time around, it's a really helpful skill. There are plenty of brokers out there now that are helping connect money, because you know, it still is private money, unfortunately.
Then you got to pay a fee.
Yeah.
But like on our end, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's unfortunate that COVID happened. I think through the end of this year, it's going to be a little bit tougher to find people to raise money from. I mean, you have the most experience of raising money out of anybody on this panel right now. But
yeah, I mean, I think the network piece is really, I think, important, or finding those communities or pockets of communities. Y Combinator for us was huge. Yeah, we also pitched at ArcView as well. I think we also did a pitch at Weed Club. I think we've been everywhere. Our goal is there was an opportunity to pitch. It was great. I think it's an opportunity to really hone your story. I think that's also probably one of the most important things. What are you selling? We raised our first round at a $10 million valuation, and we were only like 4 months old. We should have never gotten the valuation we've gotten in reality, but we pitched a story that we were going to be the Uber of weed at the time. You know, it's definitely evolved since then, but there was a vision to dream big, and you know, we also needed a specific amount of capital that we wanted to, you know, go on this journey. So having a clear idea how much you want to raise, what the story is, and you know, investors now are everywhere. I used a place called AngelList. That was pretty helpful for us. We also looked at what people were investing in, where their partners were, kind of researched, you know, what they're doing on social and seeing what their portfolio is. We also asked for recommendations from founders. You know, if you're going to marry someone, you're going to get some reference checks. It's that trust but verify mentality. So we went as far as saying, hey, founder, what's it like working with so-and-so? Or if we spoke with an investor, hey, who do you co-invest with? So trying to add on that extra referral, you know, is just another, you know, step forward. You know, most of the time you'll hear no, or I don't think I have somebody, but sometimes you get that yes, and then you kind of pull out that thread. And also know, like, for me, investors, sometimes they just close overnight. It was a relationship you built over 9 months or 12 months, and you just kept sending them update emails or trying to find her a way to you know, showcase that you're making progress. Yeah, so those are a bunch of things, and people are home, they're reading their email, they're on social. There's a lot. But the best thing also is like an intro. If you can get a full intro from someone they trust, you trust as well, that also, helps go through the inbox. Cool.
Cool.
This is great. I think we just finished.
Wow. No
Unless
way.
you have
There's
anything else.
so much more to talk about.
There is a lot to talk
lot.
about. But, I think this is what we've had a time allotted for. We appreciate all the questions. You have all our emails here if you want to reach out.
Yeah.
We're definitely here to be helpful. The goal is that we move this industry forward together and hopefully have better standardized documents and agreements where we can move forward quickly without the cost of it all.
Yeah.
Thank you, Krishid. Thank you, Lara. Thank you, Jason, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for coming. You guys rock. Any closing thoughts or comments that you want to share before we head out?
Just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for including me and the opportunity to help comment on this. And I know Jay couldn't be here tonight, but I'm sure he feels the same way. Everybody who got to work on this, I think we just really appreciate this opportunity to create a document like this for our industry, right? That we don't have to go back and rework, right? And so it's just been a fantastic experience, and I liked working with all y'all. So thank you.
And yeah, thanks Arya and Hua for putting this all together.
Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome.
Thank you for putting something together that also contemplated social equity licensees of businesses as well. It's huge for that community to have a document, a tool like this, because oftentimes they don't have a lot of capital at startup, and the last thing they need is a legal bill.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, speaking of which, if there are any lawyers out there or any equity applicants in San Francisco or in the Bay Area, contact me. The Bar Association of San Francisco does have a pro bono legal services program for equity applicants that are participating in the cannabis industry, and we can hook you up with a free lawyer. So pretty cool. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. Everybody, their emails are there on screen, so reach out and we will see you all again on another webinar soon. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye. Take care.
Right.
Bye.